Oh yeah. Dude, what a shredder. Now let's really kick some ass.
Welcome to the Friends of Dan Music Podcast. I'm Dan Miles. You've been listening to the music of the California Transit Authority, featuring the electrifying guitar work of my guest today, Marc Bonilla. The name of the track is Something Different, and it can be found on their 2007 Full Circle CD. Marc also tours and records with Keith Emerson, and was one of the three Fates on the 2012 orchestral project that was recorded in Germany with conductor Terje Mikkelsen. He's also worked with a number of other well-known musicians, including Eddie Jobson, David Coverdale, Glenn Hughes, Ronnie Montrose, Kevin Gilbert, and James Newton Howard. His guitar can be heard on the soundtracks of a number of blockbuster films, including The Bourne Legacy, The Replacements, The Scorpion King, The Green Lantern, and Iron Man 2. He also regularly contributes to the score of the hit FX TV series Justified, along with Toto keyboardist Steve Porcaro. And in addition to all the work he's done with other people, he's also released some truly stellar solo albums that we'll be talking about and hearing some samples from as well. So, without further delay, let's get him on the line. Joining me on the phone from Los Angeles is Marc Bonilla. Welcome.
Hey, nice to be here, or nice to be there. I guess I'm in two places at once.
Yeah, that's true. Well, actually, you're all around the world when this thing hits the internet.
Okay.
Well, when I spoke to Keith Emerson, he mentioned that prior to the Three Fates project, you did some concerts with Terje Mikkelsen in Mongolia. I think when most of us hear that word, we think of Genghis Khan and maybe Mongolian barbecue, and that's about it. So what were your impressions of modern-day Mongolia?
Well, it's kind of still a dichotomy between the nomads who come in from the Gobi Desert and have their own society in the outskirts of Mongolia. We were in Ulaanbaatar, which is the capital, and all around them are the nomads that still travel, through the desert, and they have these areas. They still use coal for heating, which becomes a problem in the winter because I think Ulaanbaatar is the actual number one city that has the worst air quality.
Wow.
Because of it, and they're trying to lobby to try and get them to use cleaner stuff. But you're talking about hundreds of years of tradition. So,
right.
but the people there are amazingly sturdy people, and you can imagine why. Their heredity is kind of dictated. So, the women are gorgeous. By the way, they have a real beauty that is different than the ones you'll get in Polynesia or Japan or China. They're just a different vibe. And what's odd is what's so funny is there are no addresses in Mongolia. There's no, you can't say I live at 2800 Genghis Street. There's no numbers. There's no. They just go down to the blue building, turn right, and go a couple blocks. You'll see you'll see an abandoned gas station. Go to the left. It's right around in there.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how they get their mail. But apparently they do. They have it worked out where everybody knows where everybody is.
How did you guys determine there was a demand for Western music there?
Well, it was actually done because of the ecological concerns that they have there. We started this project with Tadje Mikkelsen in China. It was I think Keith might have explained on his interview that they used the piano concerto for part of the film that they were using in accordance with, or in conjunction with the orchestra. And while they were playing, they would show a film, and they used some of Keith's music for that. So we actually went over there and performed with them. And then we had interest to do an album, and in Germany that later that year in October. And we decided that we might want to test the waters out with this stuff because it's very difficult to play in Mongolia, since there was a Mongolian orchestra, and Tadje had been invited to be the guest conductor there. So I collected Travis Davis and Troy Laketta, who has never played with an orchestra. He's just played with Tesla. And so he was nervous as hell going in at first, because, again, this is explored terrain for him. Yeah. So he said, hey, man, the more we can do before we record, the better I'm going to feel. So it was going to up his comfort level if we could try this out in Mongolia, thinking relatively accurately that if the whole thing became a complete mess, at least we're in Mongolia. We're not in some high-profile area,
Definitely not a media hub, so I think you can do things quietly there.
Yeah, and that's what we did, But it was a great experience. I've been there twice now, and it just, the people are wonderful. They're warm, and like I said, they're fearless, man. We were watching window washers up on these high-rise buildings with no apparatus. They were just running around up there. I've never seen anything like it, man. 'Cause it's just in their genes. They're just incredibly brave people, and sturdy and tenacious, really.
Well, I'm glad I asked you about that. That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Well, let's jump to Munich and talk about your contributions as a composer to the Three Fates project. You've got 3 writing credits, including the tracks Walking Distance, The Morning Sun, and American Matador. Matador was a title track of one of your solo albums, so I know that one existed before the project, but were the other 2 written specifically for it?
Yeah. It was the first time that I've actually, been able to write expressively for orchestra, not for soundtrack for a movie or anything like that, where you might be using an orchestra, but this was purely written to stand or fall on its own merit as an orchestral piece. So that was what I enjoyed most about writing for the orchestra.
So it must have felt kind of liberating for you.
Yeah, it is, because you don't, with soundtrack writing, as wonderful as it is and as varied as it is and as much opportunity as you get working with different flavors, different types of artistic, expression, musicians, etc., it still has to be kind of approved by committee, by the director, by the producers, whoever happens to be in an executive role. it all kind of has to pass muster with everybody, and of course everybody has a musical opinion, whether they're warranted or not, and that you have to try to accommodate. Whereas when you're dealing with just yourself as a composer and a musician, you only have to satisfy yourself and just hopes that the people out there will get what you're saying, and so in that way, yes, you're right, it is liberating in that matter, because you don't have to worry about second-guessing anything that you're doing.
Yeah. I know it's an instrumental, but did you have a concept in mind for The Morning Sun?
Yeah, it was basically a story, not so much of a story, but a sentiment about the tenacity of the human spirit, whereas you can be given some incredibly bad news or something devastating happens to you, and you go through this period of shock, disbelief, anger, and sadness, and ultimately acceptance, and how the heart is such a resilient little muscle, and it's able to traverse through these gauntlets, emotional gauntlets that happen. And the tune, although very short, in my opinion, succeeded on that level, especially the last four chords. The last four chords in succession musically dictate what I was talking about shock, sadness, anger, and final acceptance to the situation. And it was just, and even the play on words being morning, spelled M-O-U-R-N-I-N-G, and then sun, which is a symbol of a new day, but at the same time you're still carrying your baggage from the day before or whatever. It's one of those things where, as you wake up in the morning, you have a clearer shot at what happened the day before, because you've been asleep and your muses have been talking to you, and you've had a break from it, at least consciously. So it really does have to do with just the tenaciousness of the human spirit and its ability to survive tragedy.
Yeah, I'm glad you clarified that spelling. I was going to do that. You're spelling mourning with a U, like when you grieve.
Right, exactly.
And if I had to compare that piece to anybody, I think it's most reminiscent to me of George Gershwin.
Oh, well, that's a compliment. I would be more than happy to be in any boat with that man.
Yeah,
so,
next time you listen to it, just keep that in mind and see if you agree. It's a couple little techniques, and you went a couple places. I thought,
It wasn't a conscious effort. I know which was actually kind of funny, and at the same time very, very validating to me, is when we cut that song, we were up listening back to it in the control room in Munich, and Torsten Schreier, who is the orchestral producer, who and I, in my ignorance, I hadn't known about him, but apparently he's like the George Martin of classical music. He's very, very prominent in that field, and knows just about everything there is to know about classical music. And it was wonderful that he was on the project with us. But he got through listening to it, and he looked at me and he said, "You write this?" And I went, "Yeah." And he goes, "How long have you been writing?" And I said, "Well, to tell you the truth, symphonically, this is my first piece that I've written." And he almost looked annoyed, and he said, "This sounds like something Shostakovich would have written." And I go, "Well, okay, I'm not, I haven't listened to that much Shostakovich to be influenced by him. My influences are more in the Debussy Ravel era, but I will take that as a compliment." He goes, "Well, you should take that as a compliment, because this sounds like something he would have written."
Right.
And he says, "It doesn't make sense that you're a rock guitar player and you compose this stuff." He couldn't get his head around it. Especially the fact that it sounded like, according to him, it sounded like I had been writing for quite a while, which I have been writing, but not pure orchestral music, not at all. This is my first into it,
Classically oriented people underestimating people in other genres is a common thing.
Yeah, it is.
In terms of the new version of American Matador, what did you find more satisfying musically about having it performed by an orchestra?
Well, I've always heard it as an orchestra, as far as when I had first written the song, even though, I obviously couldn't afford one at the time. I always heard that piece orchestrally, and it wasn't until, that the opportunity came up to go to Munich that my wife, Joey, had said to me, "You know what, you need to orchestrate American Matador, because that needs to be an orchestral piece, and this is a perfect opportunity for you to do that." So it was actually her that spurred me to get together with Kjetil Birkenstrand, who was the main orchestrator of that piece. And he would give it back to me, and I would make a few changes, very few, And so when played, it I guess it is when just classical music in general, when you hear it, especially if it's something you've written, it makes you feel immortal. Whether or not you deserve to be or not has nothing to do with it, because through your life, you think about all the people that wrote classical music, from Beethoven to Mozart to Debussy to Ravel, Stravinsky. They were all geniuses, So even to be included in having anyone perform your piece, it's great company to be in. Not that I would ever hold myself up to the same sophistication level as they were. I would never be that, but. Still, when you hear your piece back, and I know Keith went through this too, it really makes you feel relevant. It's odd. It's an odd feeling, and very emotional feeling when you hear it, especially when it was orchestrated so well. And the front of that tune, what was originally on the second album as a rather bombastic fanfare that worked out of its own accord. James Newton Howard had done the orchestration to that, but we didn't have a real orchestra do it. We had him do it. It was good in its own right, but the way that Tadier had interpreted the beginning of this, it was completely different. It was much more cinematic, and it had an ebb and flow of tide to it, and a lot more emotional impact. And it was something that it took me by surprise when we were over there and he conducted it. I went, wow! I immediately loved it, but at the same time, I immediately became a little concerned with what am I going to play over this, because it sounded beautiful by itself. And I had mentioned one time, I said, Toddy, I don't know if you need to play over this. He goes, oh, yes, you do. You need to find something that works over this now. And I remember leaving it to the last thing that we did. I actually came home after we were in Munich. I hadn't done it then. And I did it here in the studio because I had to find a way to make that work now. And that was the main challenge of the entire album, was that intro piece, is to make it sound emotionally as full as the orchestra was playing it and as it was conceived dynamically. So, and that's what my favorite part of the song is that, because it was really a hurdle for me to get over. Because in working with Tadier, he completely changed my playing habits and my concept of music. You have to understand that this project had a lot of impact on everybody involved, from the orchestra to Keith, to myself, to Travis, and to Troy. We had never traversed in this area before. It's very hard to mix these two elements without being crowded, without being muddy, because you have a lot of instruments playing at the same time. The orchestras are not used to playing with drummers. They don't have, the groove like we have, because they basically play with timpani, with bass drum, snare drum, but never as a main groove. So they had to look within themselves, especially the fact that this music is not easy to play. Look within themselves to find that groove that they just had to find it. The concertmaster came up to me the second day and he goes, we don't have the meter that we like to think we have, especially when we're playing with you guys. And at the same time, we're saying, you know what, we don't have the dynamic expression that we need to have while playing with you guys, because the orchestra would systematically come down in volume, raise in volume, come down in tempo, change tempos before the next part, which is, for a drummer, is a nightmare. That's the one thing that he's tried to avoid all of these years, is having great straight meter. And now we're telling him, no, you got to slow down here. You got to come in at a slower tempo, which, after we did it successfully, it just made all the difference in the world. And what it did for us is, and what Tadier had done for me, was to make me aware of micro changes in the music, where even from one sentence to the next, the way to build the sentence, even if it's a repetition, is to not make it a repetition, to vary the ebb and flow of each note, so that the thing completely breathes. And it really opened me up and changed me as a musician because of working on this project. That was one of the main things. And it changed the orchestra, too, because they now had the confidence to be able to rock, where they've always wanted to, but were never able to. And were able to field large areas of very complex music as a whole. So it was a cathartic experience for everybody involved on both sides of the coin.
Yeah, it's awesome that you're able to learn from each other.
Oh, yeah. And that's really what music is all about, is discovering yourself, pushing yourself to go into areas outside your comfort zone. Otherwise, you're just repeating material. You're repeating things that you do. And as Bukowski once said, he says, as the spirit wanes, the form emerges. And it was always a brilliant comment, because it basically says if you're going to do the same thing over and over, then people are going to recognize your pattern, and you're never going to get to that next level, whatever that next level is.
Yeah.
You always want to go up at a diagonal level in your music. You always want to be playing up to the room, and always scaring yourself a little bit with the next project, going, oh boy, I don't know if I can do this. That's the reason to do it.
Yeah.
So with us, we were all scared. And at the same time, that's what we captured on the CD, was everybody out of their comfort zone, discovering something about each individual and as a whole collectively.
Yeah, it's interesting that you say when you composed American Matador, you initially, right from the start, you envisioned it as orchestral, because that's essentially what Keith said about Tarkus.
Yes, it's exactly what he said about it.
Yep.
Yeah, that's right.
Well, your third composition, Walking Distance, it has some elements that remind me of one of my favorite artists, Lyle Mays.
Oh, yeah.
What were you conceptualizing with that piece?
Well, that piece, the title itself was taken from a Twilight Zone episode,
Cool.
which was one of the first ones, and is always going to be my favorite episode, whereas it was with Gig Young. It was in the first season where he's a harried businessman in his 30s, and his car breaks down outside of town. He dumps it off at the gas station, and he realizes that his hometown is just a mile down the road. And he goes down there, and the hometown hasn't changed. His parents are still alive. Even he's there as a boy. And the whole thing is him realizing what he's lost as an adult, and he's trying to find himself, to tell his younger self, don't take your youth for granted. It was a beautiful episode, absolutely gorgeous episode. Bernard Herrmann did the score.
Oh, yeah.
And it was just one of those Twilight episodes that was just poignant, and it always stuck with me. So the tune is kind of reminiscent about what he might have felt, or what anybody feels when you go back to your hometown if you've been gone for a long period of time. It always seems smaller, and every time you walk down a street, you remember your history. You remember things that happened as if they were ghosts reenacting it in front of you, and so the piece, it starts out with this piano ostinato that continues all the way through, but it changes. That's the walking pace, and it goes through many, many different developments, many, many different rooms, as it were, in your life as you're going back in time. Even if it's a walk through your old neighborhood, you realize things that happened there, and so it also has a kind of a retro feel to it, which is what I wanted. I wanted more like a Mancini kind of a vibe in one area, and a little quizzical in another area. Just some of the different emotions that you go through when you go back to visit something that you haven't been to in a long time. You remember things that you didn't remember until you got there, and so they present themselves without even having to think about it. It just comes like a scent in the air, like, wow, I remembered that. I remember that in spring, that scent. It was Mr. Corderoli's flowers, whatever it happened to be.
Well, after that very specific setup, I think it would be a good time to stop and take a listen to that. From the 2012 Three Fates project, this is Walking Distance.